Hello and welcome to the Chiaroscuro Jazz Podcasts. I'm George Graham, Director of Artistry and Repertoire for the venerable jazz label, which for over a half-century has been presenting music from some of the world's great jazz musicians. In this series, we'll have conversations with some of today's outstanding players and their thoughts on some of the artists who have recorded for Chiaroscuro. This time, we feature one of the most acclaimed and ubiquitous drummers of today and the last nearly 50 years, Steve Gadd. An outstanding jazz drummer, he began his career in his hometown of Rochester, New York, and performed with Chuck Mangione and his longtime friend and colleague Tony Levin. Then went on to be one of the most in-demand studio musicians, playing on hundreds of rock and pop records with people like Paul Simon, where he played the now classic drum line on Simon's 50 Ways to Leave Your Lover, and recorded with such luminaries as Paul McCartney, Ringo Starr, Eric Clapton, James Taylor, and many others. He's also been in various groups at times, including one called Stuff in the 1970s, and has released several albums as a group leader, including one called the Steve Gadd Band, which was a 2019 Grammy Award winner. He started by talking about his education and his stint in the Army.
I went 2 years to Manhattan School of Music and then transferred back to Eastman School of Music, which is in my hometown, Rochester, New York. And that's where I met Tony Levin. And he was really significant in helping me get started recording, because we both graduated in '69, and I went in the Army for 3 years, and into the Army Field Band, and Tony didn't have to go, so he went to New York. And when I got out of the Army, I lived with Tony and his wife at the time, and he introduced me to Mike Maneri and Warren Bernhardt and Joe Beck. He introduced me to everyone that he had been working with for 3 years that I was in the Army. So that was a good leg up for me.
Did that lead you into doing studio work, or was that with jazz combos?
No, that led to both. We were doing. We were living in Woodstock, and we were in a band with Warren Bernhardt and Mike Maneri and David Spinoza. And while we were rehearsing with that band, we were also doing dates in the city, jingles and record dates, and it was a great time, early '70s.
Right. Now, back in Buffalo, or rather Rochester, you were working with Chuck Mangione, I understand, part of that group.
We basically grew up together, and I met him when he was playing with his brother Gap, and they had a little band and they would go to veteran hospitals or old age homes and entertain people, and I was part of the group that did that. And I met Chuck at Sampson Air Force Base. We were kids, and but we got a lot of history together.
And you were on some of those classic recordings that Mangione made with the orchestra there. Were you on the one with the Rochester Symphony?
Yeah, with Hill Where the Lord Hides, or Friends in Love.
Mm-hmm.
Did Friends in Love. He did Together. Freddie's Walking. We did a bunch of concerts up there in Rochester. We did Friends in Love. We actually did it while I was in the Army, and I was able to get a weekend leave so I could come home or go back to Rochester and do that Friends in Love thing. So.
Oh, that's cool because that got documented on the album. I think the vocalist Esther Satterfield was part of that, wasn't she?
Esther was there, and Don Potter and Bat McGrath.
Right.
Two.
Was Jerry Nywood playing with them at that point?
Jerry Nywood was playing. It was Lou Soloft or Al Porcino. Al Porcino was they did some of the gigs. It was fun. It was exciting.
Right. Well, that I guess from what you say, that wasn't a terribly long-term association. Was that sort of on and off while you were going in and out of the army there? And
Well, I mean, I did that, and then when I got out of the army, we did an album together and did a tour, and I did different projects with Chuck over the years that would involve getting back into the studio and then going out and playing live. So I'd get to see him, you know what I mean? It would be nice.
yeah. Now you, I see here, was part of the original incarnation of Chick Corea's Return to Forever band, which was a pretty influential group. Ayrton Moreira was playing with them at various times as well.
Yeah, I heard that band, Airto, Chick, Stanley, and Flora, doing, like sounding beautiful together. And I heard them. I went to New York from when I was in the Army. I was stationed at Fort Meade outside of D.C. and went and heard Chick with that band and said to Chick, man, if he ever needed me, or if there was ever a possibility that he'd want to make some music, man, I told him when I'd be getting out of the Army. And I had met him in Rochester through Chuck Mangione, so we had already played together. But that led to he put that band together, Return to Forever. The first one was with Stanley Clarke and Mingo Lewis, Bill Connors, and me. And then when the famous band that where he put it together and they stayed together was with Lenny White and Stanley and Al Di Meola, But
I think the original Return to Forever was a kind of an offshoot of Stan Getz's group.
with Joe Farrell playing.
Yeah, right. I mean, there was I remember that first album. It was called Return to Forever with Airto and I think Stanley Clarke, and I think Joe Farrell was on that.
Right. So it was good times.
Yeah, and became influential. Of course, increasingly electric as they went along with the influence of El Di Meola in that group. From around that time, which would probably be the early '70s, what were some of the things that you got involved with that you were found musically attractive?
Well, that's why I got out of the Army and moved to New York in the early '70s. So I had a band, me and Tony Levin and one of our classmates had a little trio that we were trying to put together called Mike Holmes and the Rhythm Boys. And then we had a band called Lamage, Tony Levin, me, Mike Manerian, Warren Bernhardt, and eventually David Spinoza. So, I was doing those bands and then doing whatever I could in New York, rehearsal wise or recording wise, Started getting called for some jingles because Mike Maneri at the time had a jingle company. So, Tony introduced me to those guys and I'd get some jingles, and it's a word of mouth thing, and before I knew it, I was getting, called based on recommendations from, Tony or Mike or, or whoever I met that sort of liked what I did, So, and here I am.
Right, the sort of ultimate studio musician, and working with a kind of a who's who in not only the jazz world but in the pop music world. You're currently touring with James Taylor, I understand.
Yeah, I love playing with James. It's a fun band, and he's a great musician.
Right. Well, maybe you can talk about some of the pop artists who are one does not normally think of as jazz, as people to whose music you have been attracted, and you feel you made a significant contribution in one way or the other.
Well, I did a lot of work with Paul Simon over the years.
Of course,
Um,
your famous 50 Ways to Leave Your Lover drum
yeah,
line on that. Nobody can forget that.
The problem is all inside your head, she said to me. The answer is easy if you take it logically. I'd like
Paul's always looking for a different way to do something, you know what I mean? So that was those things are pretty unique. Musically, playing with James Taylor, or I've played with Eric Clapton, and I love working with those guys. It's not an accident that as they're as big as they are. I mean, they're talented and smart and good people.
Right. Are there some people with whom you've worked who have pleasantly surprised you?
I've got great memories from working with different people, and I had fun working with Ringo. That was good. I did a couple of his albums at the beginning. Then we played on a McCartney album, Tug of War, Pipes of Peace.
when your body is coming apart at the seams and the whole thing's feeling low, you're convincing yourself that there's nobody there. I know how you feel.
And it was fun to hang and be together. But I mean, in terms of learning things musically, it's been a tremendous education working with the people that have called me to play, because I learned something from all of them. It's each session is different, each person is different, the pace of the session is different, and I did a lot of that stuff and loved it.
All right, yeah. Have you done any what you could call mainstream jazz projects? I mean, recently there was this wonderful album with you and Eddie Gomez and the late Ronnie Cuber with the WDR Big Band.
Right.
That was a great album. Was that everybody seems to love to work with the WDR Big Band out of Germany. That's it must be a great experience.
Well, it's a great band. I mean, that's all they do is just go to work and play charts, and it's been going on for a long time. And those guys make a good living, and they get a chance to play music all the time and work with good arrangers and bring in different artists. So yeah, it's a good gig for those guys. Micah Benny did the arrangements. I did a lot of work with CTI in the 70s. So I worked with
With Bob James.
Bob James and some George Benson, Phil Upchurch.
Well, that was kind of a house band, wasn't it?
Well, yeah, it was. He used me on a lot of stuff, and Ron Carter, but he also used Idris Muhammad, and I did a Joe Farrell album out there. Jim Hall, Chet Baker, so Cedar Walton. There were a lot of projects like that out there. It was in the 70s that were good.
Of artists that you've worked with also include Quincy Jones, who, of course, people know as a producer, but he was a great big band leader. Were you working with him in that context?
I was working with him in the studio for one of his albums, an album called Stuff Like That, and I did work on The Wiz, which he did the music for the movie, and with Diana Ross and Michael Jackson and Nipsey Russell, and those were the two main projects I did with him.
Mm-hmm.
Oh, and then we did a Frank Sinatra album that he produced and Phil Ramone engineered, and that was great.
Well, another group that you had in the mid-'70s was the band Stuff, which was a great funky fusion band with Eric Gale, Chris Parker, and others. You want to talk a little bit about that group and the experience working with them? You made a couple of albums under that rubric.
Yeah, that was, I had a lot of fun with that band, with Richard T., Gordon Edwards, Cornell Dupree, Eric Gale, and me and Chris Parker. I don't ever remember ever having more fun than I had with that band. I really love those guys, and I miss them, and they taught me a lot. Those guys taught me a lot. So I have great memories of them.
Right.
I mean, Eric passed away, Richard's gone, Dupree is gone. I talk to Gordon every once in a while, and I see Chris when I go to New York. But yeah, that was a special group.
Right. Now you've also put out a couple of solo albums under the Steve Gadd and Friends name. Maybe you can talk a little bit about those. And
I did one with Joey DeFrancesco.
The wonderful late Joey DeFrancesco.
And the wonderful late Ronnie Huber. And the guitar player was Paul Bolenbeck. And it's a nice organ record. I love it. Reminds me of the music that inspired me. Jack McDuff, Jimmy Smith, and I loved the organ. I loved the organ groups. It always had a good feel, and the groove could get so intense it would feel spiritual. It would just get beyond all of the bullshit, and it would just make you feel good.
Yeah, right. Well, maybe you could list some of the artists, some of the people that you have looked up to over the years as some of your musical inspirations, not only drummers, but other jazz musicians.
Well, Chick Corea, Herbie Hancock, Tony Williams, Elvin Jones, Art Blakey, Max Roach, Philly Joe, Jack DeJohnette, and then, those were guys, Gene Krupa and Buddy Rich and Louis Bellson.
But I should point out that Louis Bellson has been recorded for Chiaroscuro Records a number of times, and Gene Krupa also released an album in 1973. I think it's the only one he did for Chiaroscuro, but it was with a then mostly younger group on that project. But it featured John Bunch on piano in 1973. What is it perhaps about those artists that might have attracted you from, like, say, Gene Krupa?
Well, I was a young kid and I loved the drums. So, and Gene Krupa was like the star of the drums back in when I was like 3 or 4 years old. And it was just, I've always been drawn to that instrument. That's where my ears go. That's where my eyes go. And I grew up in Rochester, New York, and there was a club there that brought Gene Krupa in, Kay Winding, Max Roach, Art Blakey, Carmen McRae, Dakota Staten, Oscar Peterson, Dizzy Gillespie, and I could sit right next to the bandstand and watch these guys play. And also they would on Sunday afternoons, they'd let people sit in. And my parents would take me and my brother there, and Chuck Mangioni's parents would take him and Gap, and we'd all end up sitting in with these guys, you know what I mean? And because, these were clubs, so they would play, like a week at a time or 2 weeks in a couple of times a year. So you could really get a chance to know these people, It was a great way to grow up.
Seeing them in person in the same room rather than just listening to the records.
Yeah, and talking to them, and they were very nurturing and giving and encouraging. So it was nice.
Yeah. Another of the artists who have recorded somewhat for Chiaroscuro is Louis Bellson, another influential drummer. He's probably known as the first guy to use a double kick drum. And have you had an opportunity to work with him, or have your thoughts on his playing?
I love Louis' playing, and I love Louis. I would see him. We'd play at different Zildjian events. We wouldn't play together, but he'd do a couple of charts with the big band, and other drummers would. The one time that I worked with him at this, where it was a percussion ensemble piece. Harvey Mason was playing, Louis, me, Alex Acuna, and I can't remember the composer, but I remember that we were all together. And it was special because it doesn't often happen where you get to be on a session with other drummers,
Were you playing together, or were there just sort of...
Well, it was like percussion ensemble thing. So
cool.
Everybody was playing different stuff, but it was during the same piece, you know what I mean? So it wasn't necessarily playing a set of drums,
Yeah, percussion ensemble,
Yeah.
as you said. I think another of the artists who are sort of in the general vicinity musically that have recorded for Chiaroscuro is saxophonist George Young. Have you worked with him?
George is a good friend of mine, a great musician, and we did a lot of stuff together when we were both living in New York. In fact, George even played a while with Stuff. Um, and we keep in touch with him and Cynthia. So I love George. We did a lot of work with Manhattan Jazz Quintet with George Young, Lou Soloff, Eddie Gomez, and Dave Matthews.
Hmm. Yeah, I think we put out an album that was sort of that personnel. I think Ron Foyer was the keyboard player in that particular lineup on this Chiaroscuro release. Well, speaking of keyboard players, another artist that in fact, we just recently reissued his first album was Gil Goldstein. Um, have you worked with him?
I've worked with Gil a lot, and another fine, excellent musician, great arranger, great accordion player, just and a nice guy, man, good guy.
Right. Well, you've talked a little bit about some of the things that you have learned from musicians. Well, you have a little piece of advice. Let me ask you this: a piece of advice for someone coming up of mistakes to avoid.
Well, don't be late. Um, it's just you gotta wanna you have to really wanna be there, and you got to put 100% into it. And the gift is aside from making money and being able to support yourself playing music, the other gift there is to be able to give someone something that they're looking for. And that's when you get called for a session, that's what the job is. You got to try and figure out what the artist wants, what the producer wants, and just how to get the music where we all agree on that. That's what, you know what I mean? And it's a process. It's not an event, and you have to really be willing to be there 100%. So show up on time, please and thank you, and other than that, you know what I mean? I wouldn't be afraid of making mistakes. I think that, like a lot of times, if I made a mistake uh, playing, I'd repeat it 4 bars later and make it part of the song. You know what I mean? So it's like you got to just, you can't be too hesitant, and we learn from our mistakes. But whatever you do, give it 100%.
Is there any final comments you might want to say? Now, oh, that's right. You have a book out. We want to mention that before we go.
Oh, well, Hudson, I did a drum book called Gaddaments. It came out about a year ago, and that's been doing really good. And I had a lot of fun doing it. And 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 Rob Wallace at Hudson Music we've been talking about, doing a book about my life with pictures and stuff. And I was sort of hesitant because I just, there's so many things that I've forgotten, you know what I mean? But now that, since the pandemic and I've had a little bit more time, after we finished the drum book, we started getting right into talking about, where I grew up and my life, and we finally got it done, and it's going to be coming out in September. So I'm excited about that.
A big thanks to Steve Gadd for sharing some of his experiences. You can find more about Steve on his website at drstevegadd.com. That's drstevegadd.com. Let's go out with a Chiaroscuro recording by one of Steve Gadd's frequent collaborators, saxophonist George Young. This is Caribbean Happy Feet from George Young's album Old Friends. Caribbean Happy Feet from George Young's Chiaroscuro album Old Friends, featuring Lou Delgado on additional reeds, Ron Foyer on piano, Tony Marino on bass, and Tom Whaley on drums, with Jamie Haddad on percussion. You can find information on this and over 100 other titles on Chiaroscuro on our website at chiaroscurojazz.org, where you can find more of these podcasts. And why not subscribe to the Chiaroscuro podcasts wherever you get your podcasts? Join us next time for another conversation with one of today's great jazz musicians. This is George Graham, your producer for the Chiaroscuro podcast series. Our co-producer is Jim Della Croce. Thanks for joining us.